So good morning, everybody. Dr. Magan, thanks for the invitation to come and speak here on NATO. I think that as Israelis, we tend to be highly critical towards ourselves, towards everybody else. It's kind of, I think, a national character. But I think that if I try to bring, and I'm again shifting the gear a little bit from a NATO perspective or a European perspective to how things at NATO are being watched and looked from a more, I would say, as Dr. McGann said, a local point of view, a partner's point of view. I think that still we need to acknowledge several points at NATO which are not necessarily negative. So what I will try to do is I have collected a few points. Some of them will relate to NATO as an organization and others to how we see NATO, how do we relate to NATO. When I say we, I refer mainly to Israel, even though, of course, Israel is a part of a wider framework that, by the way, in 2019 is marking or celebrating its 25th anniversary. So here we have another landmark to mention. And again, I think, and again, I allude to what Dr. McGann said at the very beginning of his presentation. The world 70 years ago, 50 years ago, even 18 years ago was much more simple. You had the NATO Alliance, you had the Warsaw Pact, you had the Soviet Union. The world was divided into according to much I would say clearer lines. You knew who are with you, who are against you, who are your foes and enemies, and who are your allies. Today it's not. It's no longer the case, and this is something that we have to relate to. I mean, the world is constantly changing, rapidly changing. You have today countries are changing, governments are changing. You have in the past 18 years, but even before, a whole array of non-state actors, which is a completely new element that was brought into the picture. You are not dealing only anymore with all kinds of national liberation movements that have some agenda or territorial agenda. It's a completely new arena, and the challenges accordingly. And if we speak on challenges. From the technological point of view, the world also began to ever more rapidly change. I think that today we see the changes coming wider in terms of number, but also in the terms of the time span that I would say that divide us between one technological progress or novelty and the other. And to all these kinds of elements or challenges, NATO should give an answer, and it's not easy. It's not easy, and again, I see it also when we speak, within brackets, perhaps on the Middle East. Countries here tend to change on a slower pace. Once you have these kinds of challenges coming one after another in a matter of years, sometimes even less than years, it's more difficult for governments, for societies, for institutions to react. And then you have, of course, with the certain political cultures, you see events like unfolded in 2011 with the Arab Spring, but also others. So these are all things that we should take into account. I don't think that if we have spoke a year ago, perhaps a drone challenge would have been as imminent as it is today. Or if we would have spoken 5 years ago, we would speak on cyber the same way that we speak on cyber the way we do today. So this is I would say the rapidity of the changes. Now, when it comes to NATO, and again, perhaps three points on the organization that also affects us. I think that both Dr. Magan, both Dr. Bertie and Jan, they spoke about the fact that NATO is primarily oriented to provide security to the Euro-Atlantic area, or mainly Europe. I think that I am looking at it from a slightly different point of view, because when we look at NATO, and again, this is my, when I'm doing my current job, it's my second tour with NATO because I was posted to Brussels in the past. I was dealing with NATO in earlier years of my career at the ministry. When I entered, when I began to deal with NATO, it was the alliance was composed of 19 countries. Now it's 29, moving to 30. To this, you should add the EAPC, all the Euro-Atlantic Partnership. To this, you should add the Mediterranean Partnership. To that, you should add also, I would say, third countries such as Australia, such as Japan. You can also add countries who are affected by security, I would say, realities such as Afghanistan, such as Iraq. So all in all, it's not only the 19, 29, or 30 countries of the alliance and the immediate, perhaps partners. Today, when you talk about NATO, in my perspective, you speak more about global security provider that has, in different frameworks, different tiers, involves about 60 countries. 60 countries, it's 1/3 almost of the world total number of countries. And especially if we look territorially in terms of land mass, certainly it's most of the globe. So this is something that we should take into account. And NATO, by this, not only perhaps it's a very, and I accept this argument. Perhaps it's a very egoistic, so to speak, argument to say, okay, we primarily look at Europe for security, which is okay. No, but I'm looking at it from the upside, dimension. Indirectly, NATO also affects the stability of other regions, whether it means to do that or not. The fact is that it has an effect also on other regions. Some of them are a little bit or even more remote than the immediate Europe or the US themselves. Second point is identity. And again, it was mentioned here, and it's not a secret that NATO was founded on a certain baseline of fundamental values, which is always important. But as we know, in every relationship, marriage or other, parts are growing together, but they're also growing differently. I mean, we ourselves as human beings, the people who we are today, are not whom we were 20, 30 years ago. So does countries. Countries also change. Government change. Interests change. And this affects the cohesive sometimes of the alliance. So we have seen, and again it was mentioned here, we saw in 2014 we saw the Crimea crisis and Eastern Ukraine, of course. It's not. We should always remember also Eastern Ukraine, which brought the alliance together. We saw the INF, which brought the alliance together. But again, going to the analogy of relationship, it's not only about crisis, it's also about how you maintain and conduct your daily routine. So this is something that NATO should be looking at, I think, very closely if it wants to continue and be what it is, and also to project. And this affects also the partners, and I will get to this in a minute. Last point on NATO is the relevance. That Max Weber, the famous sociologist, he always claimed that organizations will always find some kind of an argument why to preserve themselves. So NATO doesn't need this argument because, in the world, security concerns you will always have. But at the same time, I really bring up the question of relevance as an open question, because today, when we look at, and again, looking also at the EU, and I deal also on a daily basis with the EU, the buzzword is climate change. The buzzword is immigration. Okay, also terrorism. But I would say I deliberately take it to different worlds, because it's a question, and I think it's a valid question. Should NATO be relevant in these areas? Does these areas or domains or disciplines relevant to NATO? Or the bottom line of this point is how wide do you stretch the definition of security in order to deal with everything or not when your plate is already full enough. Now a few words on the and again, whatever I've said here has relevance also to how we see NATO and also to how I mean Israel, and also to how do we relate and operate vis-a-vis NATO. So I think that Israel is a part of a framework. It's a framework which is extremely heterogeneous. By the way, so does the EAPC, you know, the other partners as well. You have Sweden, you have Finland, you have, on the other hand, I don't know, you have Minsk perhaps, and Belarus. That's not part of our.
Different framework.
Yeah. Well, elections is all over us, so so what can we do? You can see that it actually penetrates to every minute of our life, but hopefully it will end next week. But at the same time, going back to the Mediterranean, we are a part of the framework. As I said, we have Mauritania, we have Israel, and we have in the middle of the spectrum different countries with different political culture, different military or security establishments, and different needs or desires. By the way, I think that if we look at the 25th anniversary of today, and again, as someone who has been dealing with NATO in the past, we have gone a long way. I don't think that if people who embarked on this voyage in 1994 would have believed that we will be at this point today with the I would say the menu of activities that we have and the level of cooperation that we have with NATO. But having said that, I think that Israel is a sui generis in this framework. As it is in other domains. We also say it on our relationship with the EU when we speak about the Mediterranean partnership or framework there. Israel, from the technological, political, social, and other, I would say, parameters, is at least on the NATO average. So naturally, I think that we have perhaps a different set of expectations. And of course, I do not undermine or underestimate other countries that are member of this framework. And I should very much stress that we are extremely committed to this framework, and we think that it's very much needed. Again, speaking as an Israeli, I think that every framework that brings about Israelis and Arabs together also has its advantages, and of course it's extremely important because it brings also dialogue between different people from the same area. Some of the countries with which we don't have even diplomatic or other relations or contacts. So it's extremely important. But I think that NATO recognize that, you know, the different, I would say, desires or ambitions. At the beginning, it was 2019 or whatever number of NATO allies. The alliance plus 7, then +1 was added. Today, we also have +N, which allows the partner countries, each and every one of them, to cooperate with NATO according to their desires and capabilities. And I think it's important, but it should be done more. I think in order to maximize, basically it's all in NATO's interest to maximize, to exhaust each and every country, each and every Mediterranean country's partner potential vis-a-vis the organizations. So it should move more, I think, to the end without renouncing completely the other configuration of the partnership. Last but not least, again, and looking at our relationship with NATO, as I said, NATO is an alliance. I think that the problem with this is true for every major big organization. Sometimes they work slow. Sometimes it's very difficult to diverge to set the course and diverge the ship, a big ship such as NATO. I think that for us, it is, as a partner country, sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes it's, Israelis are also very much impatient, so come on, get your act together and do something. So it has this, I would say the more organizational culture. Also, there is politics, and here I would say that Israelis, and especially when we go to the military and the security establishments, unlike perhaps ministries of foreign affairs, these other establishments are not very much accustomed to multilateral settings. So for them, they get even more impatient by sometimes the slow pace of changes, the slow pace of relating to whatever potential cooperation that we can have, or developing existing one. And sometimes we should admit that NATO is sending, because of, and it goes back to the cohesion point which I mentioned before, sometimes NATO sends conflicting messages. It embarks on a certain, I would say, route, a certain proposal, a certain track, and then because of internal politics at NATO between the allies, suddenly this track is somehow, evaporates, I would say, or at least stuck. This is something which sends negative signals to military and security establishments, because by definition, and this will be my last point, my last remark, by definition, and at least in the Israeli culture, and again, not so much accustomed to the multilateral settings, for them it's easier to go for the bilateral track. So if NATO wants to maintain this relationship on the multilateral setting, the multilateral track, I think NATO should also look inwards and see how it can better handle or manage its relationship with its partners. Thank you very much.